Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back. In this lesson, let's take a look at some tips we can use to modify and restore old vintage photographs. Whether we're scanning those images into our computer or we're simply just taking a picture of them, more often than not, they need a little bit of TLC. So let's jump into it. Let's take a look at some tips we can use to restore those vintage photographs. So inside of PhotoRaw here, my first tip for restoring old vintage type photographs that you have either scanned or you've taken an image of is to crop and to level. When we're scanning these images especially, oftentimes we're left with a lot of this unwanted white negative space, and most of the time we scan it in a little bit crooked. So cropping and leveling can ensure that you get rid of those distracting edges and that you make sure the image is level and straight. So with this image here, you can see we have a lot of just sort of unwanted negative space on the outside. And we can also sort of clean up some of these edges here just to focus in on the photograph itself. So to do that, let's just hit C on the keyboard. That's going to pull up the crop tool, C for crop. And I want to mention up at the top tool modifier bar here, this menu here, this is going to open up all of these different overlays. So if you're looking for a specific overlay that you want to use as far as cropping goes, there's all of these different ones that you can access within this menu here. I typically use rule of thirds, and I'm going to use freeform here so that I can sort of freely pull in on these corners. But before we pull in on those corners there and crop it, let's just make sure everything is straight and level. To do that, I'm just going to hover over one of these corners here. I typically use the top right-hand corner. And you can see I get this little rotation option. I can just pull this corner up and down now, and I can rotate it, and I can just view the grid to straighten things out. And I'm sort of trying to straighten the grid out. You can see the grid right here. And I'm trying to line it up with his eyes there and sort of with his gaze there. And I think it's pretty good right there. And it can be kind of tricky because you are dealing with but before we pull in on the corners and crop it, let's actually make sure the image is nice and level. So rather than using the leveling tool here, because I don't really have a horizon line and some of these images are taken crooked themselves, what I typically do is I like to hover over one of the corners. I'll get this little rotation option, and I can just click and drag up and down, and I typically just keep an eye on the grid view there to ensure everything is nice and straight. And I think right there is about perfect. Nothing too crazy, but if I hit enter, it just sort of straightens up the photo there. So we've leveled everything within the image. Now let's go in and let's crop the photograph. So I'm going to hit C again to go back to my crop view. And let's just pull this in to get rid of any of those distractions on the edges there. Now, totally fine if you want to keep this little film strip bit of it, but I'm just going to remove that just so that we can focus in solely on the photo itself. I may crop that bottom just a little bit too, but perfect. So we've leveled the image, and now we just have our crop overlay on it where we want it. Let's just hit enter to apply. And there we go. We've removed all of those distractions. We've leveled the photograph to ensure that everything is nice and straight and even, and it's looking much better. And we don't have any of that wasted negative space that could be quite distracting to a viewer, especially if we have an image like this where we have sort of a lot going on within the photograph. My next tip for restoring old vintage photographs is to modify the tone of them to bring back some contrast and some detail, especially because some of these vintage images are taken with quite bright exposures. So within PhotoRaw, we can dim them down a little bit, still maintain that contrast, and make sure we can see all of those nice details within the scene. So with this image especially, what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to zoom in. So I'm just going to zoom in so that we can sort of see up close what we're dealing with here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into my Develop tab. We're going to use our Develop tab, and we're going to use this Tone and Color pane here. And let's go into the Exposure slider, and let's pull it back until we see the detail that we want to see. I think it's probably around negative 1.85 in the exposure. So you're probably thinking, well, yeah, we can see that detail, but it's still a little bit dim and flat. So what we want to do here is we want to add in a little bit of contrast. Keep in mind that contrast does darken things a little bit. So we're just going to add in a little bit there. And so we've essentially darkened the image. We've added in a bit of contrast to make sure things aren't flat, but we still can't see all of those details. So let's go down to our midtones a little bit. We'll pull up on those just a hair. And then what we're going to do is we're going to head to our white slider here. And with my white slider, because it can get crazy real quick, I'm going to hold down the J key on my keyboard to ensure I can see all of the blowouts if I do create any. And we're just going to pull up on that white slider a little bit to bring back the detail within the photograph there. So let's just hit the backslash key on our keyboard. So this is the original. And with that exposure adjustment. And keep in mind, you can constantly sort of play with that and fix it. You know, if you need a little bit of a darker image there, and then you can pull up on your whites a little bit more. But keep in mind that you will sort of meet this threshold where you are bringing in true whites into the scene. So there is a balance, but by removing that exposure and pulling up on the whites and those midtones and adding in some contrast, you can bring back a lot of those details that were lost in a bright vintage photo. So let's check out our original here. And that's with the tone and color modification. My next tip for restoring these old photographs and modifying them has to do a lot with the last tip that we're talking about inside of the tone and color pane, and that is to modify the temperature and even the saturation of these images. Now I know typically they're not going to have a whole lot of color, but sometimes it can be captured quite warm or quite cool, and you may want to fix that if it's a little bit distracting. So this image here, not too bad. It's not too cool or too warm, but let's say you want it to be a little bit less saturated and more just on the cool side. So let's go down into our tone and color pane here, and let's just head into the color section. And what we're going to do is we're just going to modify the color temperature. So you can see by pulling back that temperature, we can give it sort of a more classic, you could say, type look with a little bit more of a cool type feel. But we can also grab our temperature, and if we wanted to, we can even add in a little bit of warmth to give it a little bit more of that sort of sepia tone look. Now, one thing you could always do as well is you could modify the saturation. So if the image is just looking a little bit too colorful or it has too much of a warm or cool tint, you could just modify the saturation a bit and get rid of any of that to, again, maintain that sort of classic vintage look within the scene there. And one thing, just to sort of reiterate, and we talked about it before, but a good thing about Photo Raw and most editing applications is that you can zoom in and still modify. And so we did that earlier where we were modifying the exposure, but this is really helpful in color adjustments as well, because you can sort of take a look at the subjects up close, and then you can modify that temperature, or you can modify that saturation, and you have a nice up close detail view of the particular subjects in your image so that you don't modify too strong or you don't modify enough. But I think, again, with this image, maybe just a little bit of a cooling down on it helps to just give us that vintage classic look that we're going for. And so with this photograph here, you know, we've cropped it, we've gone in and we've modified the tone by removing some exposure, and we've modified the color section a bit by cooling down that temperature. So let's hit the backslash key on our keyboard to view the original. So this is the original. And this is with just those basic adjustments inside of the Develop tab. My next tip for restoring these old vintage images is to clean up any blemishes or dust spots that can be a bit distracting. Now with these vintage photographs, you're going to have some distress. There's going to be some, stress marks and blemishes and things like that that honestly most of the time look great and are really appealing to the viewer, and they sort of add to that vintage vibe. But sometimes you'll end up with things like this where you'll get sort of, water droplets, or I think this is maybe some wax or something like that. And so this can be sort of very distracting to the viewer. And so in cases like this, I would recommend taking these things out. But as you can see, we have these other sort of distressing areas of the scene, and they actually, I think they add a lot to the vintage vibe. But again, if you have something like this where it's, something spilt onto it or something like that, I would recommend getting rid of those sections. An easy way to do that is to go into your retouch tools here in the left-hand side. And I typically employ this perfect eraser option. The perfect eraser is really great for this, and we'll also talk a bit about the healing brush. But we're going to grab the perfect eraser. You can grab it by Shift and Q on your keyboard. And I'm just going to zoom in because it's a little bit easier as I zoom in. And I'm just going to brush over this little section of spilt stuff. And there we go. Really easy to get rid of any of these sort of distractions that oftentimes are exactly where you don't want them to be. This one may be tough because there's sort of an edge there, but we'll see if we can. So we'll fix that with the healing brush in just a second, but let's get to these other sort of areas here. I think this was the last one. Maybe do one more there. Cool. So I think that's it for those sort of spilt areas. And like I said earlier, we're going to use that healing brush. And this is great for instances like this, where you may have an edge there and you want to clean it up a little bit more precisely. So let's use our retouch tools here, and let's grab our healing brush. And I'm just going to make it a little bit lower, or the brush size a little bit smaller. And I can use the left bracket key to do that. The right bracket key will increase the size. And we're just going to brush over that little point right there. And then let's drag this down, maybe right there. This is the neighboring region, excuse me, the neighboring region that's going to sort of clone itself or heal itself on top of this area right there. I think it's looking good. So let's just go up to done. So I'm just going to go up to my settings here, and I'm just going to choose reset all retouching tools. So you can see we have a lot of distractions there. But if we go back and we undo that, bada bing, bada boom. Takes them all away really nicely, and we don't have those really sort of distracting spill areas within our scene. My next tip for modifying and restoring these vintage images is to use borders and frames to add in a little bit of interest around the edges, or to add in the desired sort of frame that you're looking for that particular image that you're modifying. So with this image, real quick, I'm just going to use one of those tips we used earlier and just go into the exposure here, pull that back, contrast, midtones a little, and then J key, pull up on my whites there, and I'll probably pull back some exposure and then pull back some whites. But it was just looking a little bit too bright there. I liked it a little bit darker, so Could be a little bit too dark, but I think for what I'm going for, it's nice and detailed there. And also, I think I'm going to cool it down just a hair. And possibly, yep, desaturate just a little bit. So just sort of a more classic sort of even black and white look there. So let's get into the borders and frames. So with this particular image here, you know, I really enjoyed the sort of elegance of the image, but I do want a nice sort of frame or border on the edges just to give it a little bit more oomph and a little bit more style. So let's add a filter, and let's add the borders filter. Now within the borders filter, there's a ton of awesome borders here. What I typically like to go and do is just go into this more menu, and there's just a plethora of amazing borders that you can choose from here. And pro tip, if you hover over this section, you can just hover over it, leave your mouse there, and then you can use the arrow key on your keyboard to go up and down and find different vintage borders that look nice. And even that border where it adds even just a little bit more, what was that, focusing screen? Even this one where it adds in sort of a little bit more blemishes, you could say, it actually looks really good. I think it adds to, again, that sort of vintage feel into the image. But, you know, there's just a ton in here that you can use to give it a nice feel. I like that one a lot. A really popular one for really making it vintage is this tintype dirty. You can get things really, really vintage there. And another one of my favorites here is the white round key. Yes, this option. This white round key one I think just looks really elegant. Gives it this sort of border there, and then we also have that white frame on the background. I just love it. So let's hit the backslash key on our keyboard to view the original here. And this is the image with a few modifications in the develop. Remember, we removed the exposure to sort of dim things down a little bit, and then we also modified that color a little bit. But the big star of the show is this border here, that black keyline border there, and then that really nice white elegant frame. I think it adds just a nice liveliness to the scene. My next tip for modifying and restoring these vintage photographs is to use local adjustments to selectively apply exposure adjustments into different areas of your photograph. So with this photograph here, I'm not going to crop it right out of the gate because I do want to show you guys a tip that you can use to avoid painting on adjustments to these bright sections. But if we take a look at this image, we can see there's some sort of bright areas surrounding our subject here. And we can add in some of that detail back into those areas by using local adjustments. So this is the original photo. I haven't done anything to it. It's the original scan. So let's go into the local adjustments tab here. I'll rename this Burn Vignette. We're going to create a vignette with a darken local adjustment. And so we have our exposure there set to -1 so that we can darken things up. So it's perfect. So we're going to use our adjustment brush. I'm going to set the mode to paint in to ensure that I'm painting this adjustment in. And let's just use an opacity of 100 and a nice soft brush edge at the feathering of 100. So I'll increase my brush size with the right bracket key, and I'm just going to paint this in sort of just right around the edges of the scene. And then I'm going to lower my opacity a little bit, maybe do around 30 or so, and then I'll paint over this mountain section there. So if I turn off the adjustment there, I think it's doing a really awesome job of bringing back that detail that we need to sort of see these different sections of the photo, but we've painted over the lines there and it's covering up that excess white within our photo as well. So what we can do to fix that is we're going to go into our gear icon here, and we're going to go down to these 3 sliders. These sliders are going to allow us to protect these particular tones from the adjustment that we're modifying. So we want to remove from our highlights. So let's just pull up on the highlights there. And be careful, you could sort of remove it from the bright areas on the page there, but you can see by pulling it up to around 35 or so, we're no longer modifying the outside as much. We're now strictly just adjusting the inside there, where we're modifying the burn vignette local adjustment there. So when it comes to local adjustments, remember that you can always pull back on the opacity to them. They can get quite strong quite quick. So remember, there's an opacity slider here to modify. And remember that this gear icon leads you to these 3 sliders here, which you can use to reduce the effect of this adjustment on those particular tones there. So even with my shadow tones in this area down here, if I want this adjustment to be not as strong down there, I can pull that up and you can see it reduces the effect of that adjustment there. Same with midtones. And we saw highlights, but you can see how great it is at keeping that white area clean so that we're not modifying it. My last tip for modifying and restoring these vintage photographs is to use Resize AI to quickly crop the image, resize to any dimension. You can recover faces if you need to, and it's also a great way to export the image into a particular file type. So I'm not going to do anything into the photo just yet. I think the photograph looks great so far. We don't really need to modify anything as far as the exposure goes. It looks very well exposed. So what we're going to do instead is we're just going to take it right into Resize AI. And inside Resize AI here, what we're going to do first is just resize it a little bit. If I zoom in, it's quite large, but I just want to maybe double that size. So let's go into the photo size pane here. And I typically like the resize to percentage option. And I'll just resize it to 200%. Just like that, just so that we have basically double the dimensions there. So if we need to print it or anything like that, we can quickly print it and we're off to the races. One thing I want to do in here though is I want to bring back a little bit of the face in there. It's just a little bit pixelated, and a great way to bring back the face, especially if you have a nice well exposed image and the face is nice and sharp and in focus, is to use this face recovery option. So I'm just going to enable this there. And you can see it does a pretty great job of bringing back, let's see here, bringing back the face there. Now, because it's using AI, it's quite realistic and quite intense. So if you want it to be toned down, you can always use this strength slider here. And I think just a little bit there, just to bring back a little bit of his face there, looks really nice. We don't need it at 100%, but you can always bring it all the way up there. Now keep in mind that this isn't going to work that well on vintage images where you can't really see the face or you can't really make out what the facial structure is. But in cases like this where it's nice and well exposed and detailed, it does a pretty great job of finding these faces and recovering those details within them. So we'll just go to about there. I think that looks pretty good. And next thing I want to do is just crop the image. So let's just crop by hitting C on the keyboard there. And I don't think I'm going to crop the entirety of the photograph. I just want to save it as a particular file size now, or file type rather. So I'm not going to crop all of the edges up to the frame that it's around. I'm going to leave a little bit of excess white on the bottom there. And the sides and the top. But if we apply that, we have our double the sized image. The face is recovered. Everything's looking great. We've cropped the image. So now all we have to do is just save it as a particular file type that we need. Well, the great thing about PhotoRAW is if we go over to this done option here, we don't even have to choose export. We can just choose done. We can now save this photo as any particular file type that we want. A popular file type with these particular images, especially if we're resizing and we want to maintain detail within the photograph, is a DNG. A DNG is a nice file type for this because it tries to maintain as much of that detail and data as it possibly can. So let's just maybe rename this here. I'll rename this military face resize. We can hit save there, and we have a nice saved image of that file in a different file type, and we have it resized, and we've recovered the face. So those are my tips for modifying and restoring vintage old photos that you've either scanned or you've taken pictures of. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson.